what is change, how does it happen, and are we any good at it? Now, before we address these questions, I want to share with you a conversation that I had at a recent annual meeting in Addis Ababa, where I was reunited with my old friend Dr. Dowett, who's the president of Africa Humanitarian Action, who I worked with 30 years ago. Now, as is the habit of people of a certain age, we spent a lot of time reminiscing about the past, and I asked him what was different now than when we used to work together. And his reply was, everything has changed, but nothing has changed. And I thought, even though his answer seemed contradictory, it was rather enigmatic and intriguing. And I'll come back to it later in the presentation. So I'll start by looking at the humanitarian system itself and reminding ourselves about what makes it so unique. I will then run you through the kind of changes that we've seen in the system over the years and how we can best interpret them. And after this, I'll move on to the world of concepts and present some different ways in which people understand the humanitarian system and how this has shaped the way that we've thought about it and actually planned for change. But don't worry, I'll warn you before we get to the heavy stuff. And finally, I'll address the big question, which is what have we learned from all of this and how can we improve our collective capacity to implement and manage change? So what makes the humanitarian system so unique, and does this uniqueness support or inhibit change? Well, we all know that the humanitarian system is composed of a large number of autonomous actors, but all with different accountabilities and no centralized governing body. System-wide change processes therefore need to be voluntary and collaborative. But experience has taught us that this has not been easy. Competition often acts against collaboration, and agencies can be reluctant to support changes that have been suggested elsewhere. And this gives rise to something called the not invented here problem. For example, the transformative agenda is seen by some as the Ocha thing. The message here is that people don't change what they don't believe they own. And unlike the corporate sector or the military, we humanitarians find it rather hard to agree on shared aims, objectives and concepts. And I only have to think of some of the ALNAP meetings that we've hosted recently in London on protection, on localization, for example, and I'm reminded that we're a very broad church and one which still does not have a shared definition of humanitarian action. And if there's no agreed endpoint to what we do, it's not easy to collaborate around shared agendas for change. And like the business world, our work includes an element of supply and demand, but there is an important difference. Unlike customers in a free market, aid recipients don't have a strong voice and cannot usually choose the types of aid they receive. Agencies decide what and how aid is delivered, and this can dampen down incentives for change and improvement. And moreover, there's a high degree of connection between our own system and other external systems, in particular national and global political systems. And in spite of humanitarian principles, most humanitarian actors are not free agents, but instead are meshed into a broad web of political relationships which may either impede or accelerate change. And I've only to think of a recent exchange I had with Stephen O'Brien, who said that when he was reporting on Syria to the UN Security Council, it was like speaking to an empty room. And we're also hugely influenced by all manner of social, economic, demographic and technological changes. Now let me give you an example. Global migration has had a direct influence on the location and size of humanitarian need, how that need is addressed, and the financial and political context in which that need is addressed. And it's also related to many other changes, including war, improved communications, climate change, and so on, all of which act directly or indirectly on the relatively small world of humanitarian action. So our system's hugely influenced by what's going on outside it, and we are just as likely to have to respond to changing events elsewhere as we are to initiate changes ourselves. But, as Dr. Dowett said to me, many things are different and changes have happened. So let's just take a few moments to reflect on what changes we've witnessed over the past 30 years or so. Yeah, the most obvious change is growth. Growth in the number and scale of emergencies, growth in funding, and growth in the number of responders and the diversity of humanitarian actors. Now, of course, we've got a lot of detail on all of this, which can be found in the 2015 edition of the State of the System report. And the system has also changed in terms of the speed of communications and the delivery of aid. And the clunky old telexes that Dowett and I remember have been replaced by smartphones. Cash transfers on phones have replaced the bags of cash that we used to stash under the seats of our Land Rovers. SMS surveys have replaced the teams of field workers who hitched rides on local buses and so on. And the nature of crisis has also changed, and the depth of conflict-related emergencies is growing and deepening, with larger numbers of people affected for longer periods of time. And agencies are increasingly seen as belligerents, and bunkerization is a growing trend in many conflict situations. Now, on the positive side, there have been a few examples of positive change, mainly, I think, through cash-based programming, and the energy for this kind of change, interestingly, has been generated largely within the system itself. And we'll hear more about how this happens in the panels. But sadly, there are areas where there appears to be little or no change. For example, we still have an accountability gap with regard to listening and responding to the needs of affected people. And the State of the System report shows that only 1/3 of aid recipients are consulted on their needs. And of those, only 20% said the agency had acted on their feedback to make improvements. And we've also witnessed changes that were unplanned, unexpected, and sometimes not entirely welcome. Faster communications, for example, has allowed affected people to engage in new ways, but it's also resulted in decision-making moving away from the field. And new public management approaches such as results-based management were designed to improve efficiency, but according to one interview from this study, assessments have also led to a lot more paper, so that between 15 and 40% of the time of an aid worker is spent filling in forms, reports, and other paperwork. I know how they feel. So, the humanitarian landscape does look different and changes have happened. But what kind of changes are they? Well, I think there are two main points to hold on to. The first thing is that many of these changes are essentially reactive. They happened either as a result of outside forces or they were adaptations made by us as a result of changes in the external environment. They were not part of a grand plan, but rather of a system facing realities and adapting to keep up with the forces of globalization. And the second conclusion is related to something else that Dowett said to me. He said that things were different and the same at the same time. And I think that on one level, Dr. Dowett was impressed by all the shiny new toys inside the humanitarian toolbox. But I think at the same time, he still felt that in spite of our efforts, we have not been able to create big shifts in the status quo. And the findings from the ALNAP State of the System report corroborate his feeling. Donor composition remains largely the same, and the bulk of financial resources are still controlled by the UN agencies. And even though there are more local and national NGOs, the big five internationals still dominate. And as Dr. Dowett lamented to me, local NGOs are still missing out. So perhaps the key message is that everything is different, but nothing is different. And this lack of deep change means that the same systemic problems keep coming round time and time again. In the words of one commentator, we are condemned to repeat. And sadly, there's a lot of truth in this, and we only have to look at the tech evaluation of the Indian Ocean tsunami to see that many of the problems and failures associated with the Rwanda emergency in 1994 had not been sorted by 2004. And then, if we compare these findings with the challenges identified at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, we can still see that many of those old systemic problems still remain. But why is it? Why does transformational change fail to happen even when key stakeholders say they want it to happen? Now, this is a question that generates a lot of opinions and explanations. Some people, they blame the hegemony of elite Western donors. Others say that we humanitarians are too woolly and corporate consultants should step in and do it for us. But I would like to suggest that the answer rests on a fundamental assumption about the way the world works. Now, earlier on I said I'd warn you when we get to the heavy bit. So we've arrived, so hang on. So if there's one thing that you should take away from this presentation, it's that the way you understand something determines the way you try and change it. And the thing is that we have tended to understand the humanitarian system as though it worked like a machine, which functions according to inputs, outputs, and levers of change that can be re-engineered. So, for example, if you think of the system as a clock, you have a clear idea about how it's made and you know how it should work. If one cog wears out, or breaks, you can replace it with a new cog and the mechanism is fixed. And this kind of thinking has shaped many of the change tools we use, like the log frame, for example. There, changes seem to be linear, and processes of institutional change have reflected this thinking. Now, standard practice is to first identify what the problem is, and then set up processes to change organizational structures and procedures which are rolled out often through training activities that aim to communicate these changes and follow the new procedures. Now, there are undoubtedly strengths to this process, but it's underpinned by an implicit assumption that the future can be broadly predicted and that people will act in a rational way. And if they don't, they will allow their actions to be controlled by other people further up the hierarchy. But here's the thing, it's not true. And this standard policy approach is unlikely to ever bring about deep transformational changes. Instead, we need a more deeper and a more nuanced understanding about how the humanitarian system truly operates. So if the humanitarian system is not a machine, what is it? Well, it's possible to think of it in many ways, all of which have real explanatory power. For example, what if we imagine that the system works like a market in which humanitarian organizations exist in competition with each other for a market share? And if we imagine it like this, we see an environment where organizations provide or sell their services, they prosper and grow, whilst those that do not become obsolete, they lose their customers and they die. And indeed, I think many CEOs and leaders of humanitarian agencies subscribe to this way of thinking. Or we could imagine it like a political world with an emphasis on organizational interests and careers, the desire for self-preservation and growth, and of course the practice of negotiation is important here, in which agencies are willing to lose power in some areas as long as they get it back in others. So change happens through negotiation and bargaining, and we can see this logic underpinning the grand bargain itself. Or, interestingly, we could think of the system as a mind, where people cannot grasp the whole of reality of which they're a part. Instead, we all unconsciously select elements to create an internally consistent representation of reality, which we require to live our day-to-day lives. The mind will always struggle to resist change and hold on to this existing representation. And minds, of course, are also full of personal beliefs, hopes, desires, and fears. And this reminds us that change is essentially about people, emotions, and identity, all precious things that people want to hold on to. And finally, we might want to imagine the system as a complex, adaptive system. Now, many of you, I know, are using the term ecosystem, which indeed is an example of a complex, adaptive system. I think I heard the State Secretary use the word ecosystem earlier. And it can be useful because it implies that change is non-linear and unpredictable. Now, I'm no expert on ecosystems, but I do know a lot about football. Now, I hear you say, what on earth does football have to do with all of this? Well, a football match is an excellent example of a complex adaptive system. Now, let me explain. I am a Spurs supporter, and a few weeks ago I went to see Chelsea and Spurs at Stamford Bridge. So Spurs dominated for the first 40 minutes. They played with three at the back, and they used Walker and Rose as wing-backs, both of whom were attacking Chelsea's flank very effectively. And man for man, Chelsea's players may have been better than Spurs, but our players added up to more than the sum of their parts. Christian Eriksen scored a great goal. Spurs were one up and flying. Chelsea couldn't get their foot on the ball. It was great to see. The Blues were being embarrassed by their North London rivals. Spurs scored again, but in a disputed decision it was disallowed, and an outraged Walker was booked for dissent. But I wasn't worried. We were still in control and coasting. Then, in Chelsea's first meaningful attack, Hazard picked up the ball, began a mazy run into the Spurs box. Walker, on a yellow card, was afraid to tackle him. Hazard passed to Pedro, who swiveled and half-volleyed the ball into the net. The referee blew his whistle for half-time and the mood changed. Chelsea were on a high, and Spurs, having dominated the game, went in with their heads down, deflated after a sucker punch. You could see it in the body language. I couldn't believe it. We'd started so well, I never saw it coming. And in the second half, Spurs began to tire. Diego Costa must have sensed it, and he floated the ball over to Victor Moses, who was running into the D. Again, Walker on his yellow card was afraid to tackle, and Moses stroked the ball into the net. Chelsea had won. They had changed their formation. They had changed their tactics. They had exposed Spurs' defensive frailties and had pulled off a very unlikely victory. I was as sick as a parrot, as they say, but at the same time, I was aware that I had witnessed a very interesting, complex, adaptive system in action, where individuals were part of a dynamic, changing event that was bigger than any one person, where people changed their behaviours in response to unexpected events. And I think complexity theorists, we'll ask Duncan later, they call this emergence non-linearity, whereas I just call it football. Now, there are other ways of thinking about the system too, and you can find them all in the discussion starter and the background paper. But the point I want to make here is that we can learn more about how the system works by looking at it through different lenses. But let me also issue a gentle health warning here. None of these lenses provide a true and complete picture of reality, but they do illustrate that there's a lot more to change than the machine model suggests, and that change is actually complex and hard to predict, most unlike a machine, in fact. Now, all very interesting, you may say. You know, I'm a football supporter, I know a lot of other stuff, but does this mean that we're all helpless in the face of random and unforeseeable events? Well, fortunately, we don't need to be that pessimistic, and it's possible to use these ideas to come up with concrete actions for helping us guide and support change as it actually happens. Now, the paper mentions several ways to do this, and I will close by mentioning a few examples that I particularly like. So let's begin with how to deal with the unpredictable nature of change. A first step may be to rethink the role of leaders. The things leaders do are generally far more influential than the things leaders say. And in order to recognize and work in an unpredictable world, leaders need to demonstrate a measured loss of control, namely that they have to remain open to ambiguity, to doubt, and to conflict, and to allow space for these natural companions of change to be expressed. We know that change is a constant, and in a complex adaptive system, and because of this, it may be prudent to harness momentum and support changes that are already happening rather than starting things from scratch. And because of the multiple linkages between us and other political, social, and economic systems, we may sometimes need to catalyze change outside the system in order to make changes within it. And moreover, we should be looking to use networks and decentralize the processes when planning for change. Successful change processes are often built around functional teams with a strong field presence. And this can create multiple responses, of which some will fail, but others will be successful and can be expanded. And the system, as a mind, reminds us that change is fundamentally about people and not levers and buttons on a control panel. Emotion can drive or inhibit change, and there's real value in actively seeking out concerns and disagreements and discussing them with interest and respect. And there are many other examples in this background paper, and the challenge is for us to adapt our behaviour to recognise and support the way change actually happens. And that, of course, is what we're going to be doing over the next day and a half in the panels, the Agora, and the Story in 5, and all the other exercises that we've got in store. And personally, I'm really, really looking forward to it. I am a little bit sorry that my old friend Dr. Dowett was unable to be with us, as I think he would have been surprised and hopefully pleased to discover that his throwaway remark about change had been taken very seriously. But I'll certainly tell him next time I see him. Thank you very much.